The large lecture hall at the University of Michigan buzzed with the low chatter of students settling into their seats. Laptops clicked open, notebooks rustled, and tired eyes scanned equations from the last lecture. It was just another Tuesday morning in Professor Linda Cartwright's advanced calculus class, a course infamous for its brutal difficulty and even tougher instructor. Professor Cartwright, a woman with sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and an unwavering gaze, strode into the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The moment she entered, silence fell like a curtain. Her reputation preceded her. Students knew there was no room for error, no shortcuts, and certainly no sympathy. If you were in her class, you had to earn your place. She moved with precision, snapping a piece of chalk between her fingers before turning to the board. Without a word, she began scrawling intricate equations across the surface in flawless script. Today's topic, Laplace transforms, a complex concept even top students struggled with. Some students scribbled furiously, trying to keep up. Others stared blankly, already lost. But in the middle of the room, Daniel Reed sat quietly, tapping his pen against his notebook. Unlike the others, he wasn't struggling. In fact, he wasn't even paying full attention. His mind worked faster than the equations on the board. Today, however, would be different. Today, Daniel was about to step into the spotlight, whether he wanted to or not. Amidst the sea of students scrambling to take notes, one figure remained noticeably unfazed: Daniel Reed. Tall and lean, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he blended effortlessly into the crowd. Unlike his classmates, who frantically jotted down equations, Daniel sat back, tapping his pen rhythmically against his notebook. He had never been the type to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class, never raised his hand unnecessarily, and certainly didn't try to impress anyone. But behind his quiet demeanor was a mind that processed numbers and patterns faster than most. While others struggled to make sense of Professor Cartwright's equations, Daniel could already see where they were going before she even finished writing them. Numbers had always made sense to him. Unlike words, which could be twisted, or emotions, which could be unpredictable, math was absolute, unshakable. It followed logic, patterns, rules. And Daniel excelled in it effortlessly. But he wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He just wanted to get through the class without unnecessary attention. That, however, was about to change. As he casually glanced up at the board, something caught his eye. A small but significant mistake in Professor Cartwright's equation. He hesitated for a moment. Should he say something? After all, Cartwright wasn't the type to accept being corrected, especially not by a student. But Daniel had never been one to let errors slide. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand. And in that single moment, the trajectory of the entire class, and his place in it, shifted. The moment Daniel Reed raised his hand, the atmosphere in the lecture hall changed. A subtle shift, barely perceptible at first, but enough for the surrounding students to pause their note-taking and glance in his direction. Professor Linda Cartwright, standing rigid at the front of the room, arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said, her tone cool, indifferent, as if she already knew whatever was about to come out of his mouth would be insignificant. Daniel remained composed. "There's a mistake in the second step of your equation," he said plainly. A murmur rippled through the students. Some exchanged curious glances, while others stiffened in their seats. It wasn't often that someone dared to correct Professor Cartwright, a woman known for her unwavering confidence and zero tolerance for student errors. She turned slowly to the board, her sharp eyes scanning the equation she had written. For a fleeting second, her jaw tensed almost imperceptibly, but then she turned back to Daniel with a smirk. "Oh? And what exactly is the mistake, Mr. Reed?" Daniel could hear the condescension in her voice. He could sense the challenge buried beneath the politeness. She wasn't actually interested in his correction, she was daring him to prove himself in front of the entire class. Standing up from his seat, he remained calm. "You applied the Laplace transformation incorrectly," he said, pointing to the board. "The coefficient shouldn't have been factored out, yet it alters the integral limits, which changes the function's final output." The murmur in the class grew louder. A few students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Daniel, however, remained completely at ease, as if he had just pointed out something as simple as a typo. Professor Cartwright tapped her chalk against the board, examining the problem again. She wouldn't allow herself to appear shaken, but Daniel saw it, the subtle clenching of her jaw, the tightening of her grip on the chalk. Then, after a pause that stretched just a second too long, she turned back to him with a thin, forced smile. "Well then, Mr. Reed," she said, stepping aside. "Since you seem to have such a keen eye, why don't you come up here and fix it?" A few students chuckled under their breath. They saw what she was doing. This wasn't an invitation, this was a test. Cartwright wasn't just challenging Daniel's correction, she was challenging him as a student, as if daring him to prove he wasn't just trying to show off. Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked calmly to the front of the room, took the chalk from her hand, and without any hesitation, began erasing the incorrect step. There was no stutter in his movements. No second guessing. The chalk glided across the board in smooth, deliberate strokes as he rewrote the equation, each symbol falling into place effortlessly. As he worked, he spoke not to brag, not to lecture, but simply to explain. "The transformation should be applied after factoring the term, not before," he said, his tone casual. "Otherwise, you end up modifying the function's original behavior, which throws off the entire integral solution." The room had gone completely silent. By the time Daniel set down the chalk, the equation was flawless. He turned to face the professor. For the first time, Cartwright hesitated. She wasn't used to being corrected, let alone publicly, and certainly not by an undergraduate student. There was no mistake in his work. And that's what frustrated her the most. She gave a curt nod, barely acknowledging the correction. "Fine," she said. "You've corrected it. Congratulations." Some students exchanged glances. That was it? No admission of error? No praise for his insight? Daniel didn't expect her to acknowledge it. He wasn't looking for approval. He simply returned to his seat, unfazed by the tension that still hung in the air. But Cartwright wasn't done with him yet. If he thought she would let him correct her and walk away unscathed, he was mistaken. The professor turned back to the board and, without missing a beat, began writing another problem, one far more complex than the last. This time, it sprawled across nearly the entire surface, filled with intricate integrals and complex differential equations. Then, with an almost mocking smile, she turned back to him. "Since you have such a keen eye for mathematics, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness, "why don't you solve this?" The room held its breath. Daniel didn't blink. He stood up, once again, and walked back to the board. But this time, the stakes had been raised. This wasn't just about solving an equation. This was about proving he belonged in this room, and that he wasn't going to back down. The challenge had been set. The massive equation sprawled across the board, an intricate mess of integrals, transformations, and differential operators, designed not just to test knowledge but to overwhelm. Professor Cartwright, arms crossed, stood to the side, her smirk just barely restrained. The room was still. Every student in the lecture hall watched, their eyes darting between Daniel and the board. Was this the moment he faltered? Was this the moment Cartwright put him back in his place? But Daniel wasn't intimidated. He stepped forward, took the chalk in his hand, and without hesitation, began writing. His mind worked faster than his hand, the steps crystal clear in his head before they even reached the board. He started by simplifying, breaking the equation down into smaller, more manageable pieces, cutting through the complexity with a surgeon's precision. As he worked, the class watched in stunned silence. Cartwright's smirk had faded. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had expected hesitation, second-guessing. She had expected him to stumble, to look at her for guidance, for approval. But he didn't. Daniel wasn't just solving the equation, he was dismantling it with ease. Each line of work was precise, deliberate. He wasn't just showing intelligence. He was proving mastery. At one point, a student near the front leaned closer, whispering under his breath, "No way." It wasn't just that Daniel was solving it, it was how he was solving it. He was finding shortcuts, recognizing patterns that most students wouldn't have even seen. He wasn't struggling. He was in control. By the time he reached the final steps, the energy in the room had shifted. There was no doubt left. The last stroke of chalk sealed the answer. Daniel underlined it, then turned back to face the class, setting the chalk down with a calm confidence. Silence. And then, a single, sharp clap from the back of the room. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't sarcastic. It was respect. Other students exchanged glances, some nodding, some whispering in hushed voices. Even the ones who had initially been skeptical now looked at Daniel differently. But the most telling reaction of all came from Professor Cartwright. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze flicked to the board, scanning his work, searching for even the smallest mistake, something, anything she could use to dismiss him. But there was nothing. He had solved it flawlessly. She inhaled slowly, then turned back to him. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. Finally, she spoke, her voice clipped. "Sit down, Mr. Reed." But Daniel didn't need her approval. The math had already spoken for itself. The weight of Daniel's achievement still lingered in the air, a silent force that shifted the energy of the entire room. The moment was undeniable. He had done the impossible. He had not only solved the equation but had done so with confidence, precision, and skill far beyond what anyone had expected. Professor Cartwright stood still, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk just a little too tightly. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. She had set out to expose Daniel's arrogance, to make an example of him in front of the class. Instead, she had become the lesson. The students weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at him. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Some students glanced at each other, silently processing what they had just witnessed. Others leaned forward, scanning the problem on the board, trying to follow Daniel's thought process, as if seeing it with fresh eyes would help them understand how he had done it so effortlessly. And then, from the back of the class, a single clap. A slow, deliberate clap. It came from one of the students who had initially scoffed at Daniel, someone who, just moments ago, had assumed he was overstepping, showing off. But now, even he couldn't deny what had just happened. A few more claps followed, hesitant at first, then growing. Daniel simply stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. He hadn't done this for applause. He hadn't done this to humiliate Cartwright or to prove anyone wrong. He had done it because he loved the math. That made all the difference. Cartwright cleared her throat, forcing the room back to order. The applause died down quickly, but the energy remained. Without looking at Daniel, she turned to the board. "Fine," she said, her voice measured. "You solved it." There was no acknowledgement beyond that. No congratulations, no recognition of his skill. Just a reluctant concession, a forced admission that he had, indeed, completed the challenge she had thrown at him. She reached for the eraser. But she hesitated. She didn't want to erase it. Because once it was gone, so was her control of the narrative. Instead, she turned back to the class and exhaled sharply. "Let's move on," she said, pushing forward as if nothing had happened. But her tone lacked the same certainty it had before. Something had changed. As Daniel made his way back to his seat, he could feel the shift in the way people looked at him. Some students nodded at him with newfound respect, others whispered under their breath, their words unreadable. Even those who had dismissed him before now seemed to regard him differently. The moment had spoken for itself. And for the first time, it wasn't the professor who controlled the room. The tension in the lecture hall was palpable. Professor Cartwright, still reeling from Daniel's unexpected success, wasn't done with him yet. She refused to let the balance of power shift completely in his favor. If she couldn't humiliate him outright, she could at least push him to his limit. She turned back to the board, her movements sharp and deliberate. Without a word, she began writing again, chalk scraping against the surface. The problem that emerged was nothing like the first. This was on a completely different level. It was a graduate-level equation, one filled with nested integrals, differential operators, and non-trivial transformations. A problem that even seasoned students struggled with. A problem designed not just to test knowledge, but to test endurance, intuition, and the ability to work under pressure. When she finished, she took a step back, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but her intention was clear. She turned to Daniel. "Since you seem so confident," she said, voice laced with something that wasn't quite amusement, "let's see if you can handle this." A murmur ran through the class. This wasn't fair. Everyone could see it. But that didn't seem to matter. Daniel, however, didn't hesitate. He pushed his chair back and stood up once more, his face unreadable. He didn't even look at Cartwright. His eyes were locked on the board. The equation was brutal, layers upon layers of complexity designed to break even the most capable students. But Daniel wasn't intimidated. He walked to the front of the class, picking up the chalk without a word. And then he began. The room was silent as he worked. Where others would have hesitated, he flowed. His movements were smooth, his calculations seamless. It was as if he wasn't solving the problem, he was unraveling it, breaking it down, reshaping it into something familiar. Every symbol he wrote carried precision. Every step he took made the solution clearer. The students who had doubted him before were now completely transfixed. Halfway through, he paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of certainty. He turned his head slightly, glancing at Cartwright. "I assume," he said, voice calm, "that you want this expressed in terms of eigenvalues rather than trigonometric expansion?" A few gasps rippled through the room. He had already visualized the outcome. Cartwright's expression flickered, but she gave a small nod. Daniel turned back to the board, adjusting the approach without missing a beat. More chalk strokes. More silent gasps from students as he navigated the problem with an ease that defied expectations. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he boxed the final answer. Daniel set the chalk down and turned around. Cartwright's jaw was tight, her expression unreadable. She scanned the board, searching for any mistake, any flaw. There was none. The classroom sat in stunned silence, eyes flicking between the completed equation and their professor, waiting for her response. After a long moment, she inhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," she muttered. But the class knew he had one. The energy in the lecture hall had shifted. Daniel had won the battle, but Professor Cartwright wasn't about to concede the war. She stood rigidly at the front of the room, her fingers tightening around the piece of chalk in her hand. The silence in the classroom was deafening. She had just witnessed something she hadn't expected, hadn't planned for. A student, whom she had dismissed, had not only proved her wrong but had done so in spectacular fashion. And now, every pair of eyes in the room was on her, waiting to see what she would do next. She refused to let this stand. Clearing her throat, she turned back to Daniel, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "Well," she said, her voice perfectly controlled. "It seems you enjoy a challenge, Mr. Reed." Daniel didn't react. He didn't need to. He had already proven himself. But Cartwright wasn't finished with him. She stepped over to her desk, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a thick, leather-bound textbook. It was much larger than their assigned course material, something only graduate students or professors would typically reference. Flipping through the pages with precision, she stopped on a section deep within, far beyond anything the class had studied. She turned the book around so the students could see the dense, intimidating equations covering the page. "This," she said, tapping a particularly complicated problem, "is from an advanced graduate-level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. But then came the twist. She smiled, not warmly, but with a glint of challenge in her eyes. "Since you seem to have such a natural talent for this, Mr. Reed, why don't you prove it?" The classroom buzzed with whispers. Students leaned forward, intrigued. This wasn't just another problem, this was something meant for students far beyond Daniel's level. And yet, he didn't flinch. Daniel exhaled slowly, studying the problem. He already understood her game. This wasn't about academics anymore. This was a test, not just of his intelligence, but of his composure. She wanted to see if he would break under the weight of expectation. He could refuse. He had nothing to prove. But then, he saw how the students were watching him. Some were waiting for him to fail, others were watching with newfound respect. Cartwright was setting a trap. And Daniel was about to walk right through it, on his own terms. With deliberate ease, he picked up the chalk. A few students gasped. Others chuckled under their breath, sensing that something big was about to happen. Cartwright took a step back, folding her arms. "Take your time," she said, voice smooth but laced with hidden satisfaction. Daniel glanced at her for a brief moment, then turned to the board. He wasn't going to hesitate. He was going to solve this. And when he did, Cartwright would have no moves left to play. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation. Rows of students, professors, and academic professionals filled the large lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania, all gathered for one reason, the high-stakes mathematics symposium. Among the competitors sat Daniel Reed, his usual hoodie and jeans making him stand out among the neatly dressed students from prestigious institutions. He scanned the room, his fingers lightly tapping the table as he studied the panel of judges seated at the front. This wasn't just any competition. This was a proving ground. And somewhere in the crowd, watching him with calculated interest, was Professor Cartwright. The symposium was divided into several rounds. The first was mental math, a rapid-fire challenge where competitors had to solve complex numerical equations without writing anything down. The timer flashed green, signaling the start. Numbers flashed on the screen. Competitors hesitated. Some frowned, their minds struggling to keep up with the rapid calculations. But Daniel? His hands moved swiftly across the response system, punching in answers with precision, barely taking a second to confirm his calculations. As each answer was revealed, his name climbed higher and higher on the leaderboard. By the time the first round ended, he was leading the entire competition. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Even Cartwright, sitting stiffly in her seat, raised an eyebrow. The second round was theoretical application, the real test of mathematical understanding. Competitors were given advanced concepts and had to break them down into flawless proofs. As soon as the problem appeared on the screen, Daniel's mind leaped ahead. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns, rhythms, a language that made perfect sense. His pencil moved quickly, each line of his proof flowing effortlessly onto the paper. Other competitors stumbled. Some erased sections, struggling to find the right approach. But Daniel? He never hesitated. When he finished, he put his pencil down and looked up. The judges whispered among themselves, scanning his work. Then, one by one, they nodded in approval. Daniel had aced it. And just like that, he was on to the final round. The last test was speed solving, a grueling challenge that pushed competitors to their mental limits. The problem appeared on the screen, a multi-layered equation filled with integrals, summations, and logarithmic complexities designed to test endurance and logic. Daniel took a deep breath. This wasn't just a problem. This was a statement. He picked up his pen and started writing. His mind moved faster than his hands, anticipating the next steps before his pen even reached the paper. Across the room, the MIT PhD candidate, Daniel's final opponent, was working just as furiously. The tension in the room was suffocating. Seconds ticked by. Then, Daniel's hand froze. His eyes scanned the equation. There it was. A shortcut. Something no one else would see. He slashed through the steps, rewriting sections, simplifying the expressions until... Final answer. The buzzer went off. Daniel looked up, heart pounding. His opponent? Still writing. Silence fell over the room. A judge walked over, checking both answers. The wait felt like an eternity. Then... The winner of the mathematics symposium is Daniel Reed. The audience erupted. Some students clapped in awe, others let out audible gasps. Daniel? He simply exhaled, the weight of the moment sinking in. Somewhere in the audience, Cartwright sat motionless, watching him with something new in her eyes. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Respect. The next morning, the lecture hall at the University of Michigan buzzed with quiet conversations. Students who had never spoken to Daniel before stole glances at him, their whispers weaving through the air like an invisible current. The news had spread. Daniel Reed had won the mathematics symposium. Some looked at him with admiration, others with disbelief. Had he really defeated a PhD candidate from MIT? Had he really outperformed some of the best mathematical minds in the country? Daniel sat in his usual seat, hoodie pulled over his head, completely unfazed. He wasn't here for attention. He wasn't looking for validation. The numbers had already spoken for him. Then, the room fell silent as Professor Cartwright entered. She walked to the front of the class, as composed as ever, but something in her demeanor had changed. Her usual air of superiority was muted, her sharp gaze softer than before. She turned to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, and then paused. For the first time since Daniel had met her, she hesitated. Finally, she turned to face the students. Before we begin today's lecture, she started, her voice even, I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's mathematics symposium. The class held its breath. Daniel Reed took first place. A few students clapped, some nodding in approval. Others still seemed too stunned to react. Cartwright set the chalk down and faced Daniel directly. For the first time, there was no challenge in her eyes. That, she continued, is no small achievement. Daniel met her gaze, waiting for what would come next. There was a pause. A beat of silence where the entire room seemed to hang in anticipation. Then, Cartwright did something no one expected. She nodded. Not reluctantly, not grudgingly. A genuine nod of respect. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't over-the-top praise. But it meant everything. Without another word, she turned back to the board. Now, let's begin. And just like that, class resumed. But everyone in that room knew something had changed. Professor Cartwright wasn't the same. And neither was Daniel Reed. In life, we often encounter people who underestimate us, judge us based on appearances, or set obstacles in our path to test our worth. But true strength is not about proving them wrong out of anger, it's about letting our actions speak louder than their doubts. Daniel Reed's story teaches us that competence will always outshine arrogance. He didn't argue. He didn't demand recognition. Instead, he let his skills, his preparation, and his quiet confidence do the talking. And in the end, even those who doubted him had no choice but to acknowledge his abilities. This is a lesson for all of us. Whether in our careers, personal lives, or daily encounters, we will face moments where we are tested. The question is, will we let others define our worth, or will we stay true to what we know we are capable of? Respect is not demanded, it is earned. And the best way to earn it is through consistency, perseverance, and excellence. So the next time someone doubts you, don't waste time arguing. Just be so good that they can't ignore you.